Okay, thank you, Lou. Also, thank you for the invitation. Very happy to be here. So tonight we'll talk about the super exciting topic of operations. I hope I won't make it too dry. So just 1 minute about GetYourGuide, so you have the context. So we were originally a Swiss company, so we started in Zurich, and one of the smart things we did there is to bootstrap a company out of Zurich. Don't recommend it, it's very expensive. And we lived, I think, at 30% of the minimum wage for 3 years. That was fun. But it was 50% more than what we made in college, so that's an upgrade. So GetYourGuide today, so it's about 9-year-old company. We started the student project actually already before, but we incorporated the company in June 2009. So it's been almost 9 years by now. Our core business is in tourist attractions, activities, or experiences. So anything from a tea ceremony in Tokyo or shark diving in Cape Town to sightseeing river cruises in Berlin or Grand Canyon helicopter flights. So anything that customers want to do in destinations and actually the kind of experiences that people travel to. So you don't travel to Rome because you want to stay in a 2-star hotel or fly EasyJet, but because you want to see the Colosseum or maybe do a pasta making class. Company today, we have around 450 people in 14 offices. Our main offices are in Berlin, so we have around 300 folks here in Berlin, spread over Kreuzberg and Prenzlauer Berg. We've raised around 170 million of venture funding, so marketplaces are very expensive to build and take a very long time. They do become very defensible at scale, so at least that's what we tell investors, and they keep giving us money. So it's certainly something that requires constant execution. And the preface I wanted to give here is, so this is my first job, and I hope to keep it. And one of the questions is, okay, now you're a co-founder. Okay, your other co-founder is better at fundraising. That's Johannes, so he becomes CEO. And then now, so you get the COO title. Now, what does it actually mean? What is actually operations? And what does it actually mean to build an operations team? And the first thing, first you Google, okay, operations. Here's what COOs do. And then you very quickly realize that every company has a very different thing. And so today, part of it is also not giving you a perfect blueprint of what operations means or what all of that means, but give you a framework for you to then think about in the context of your business what then operations or execution and those different things mean. So hope to be able to provide some of that. But maybe just to start off, I would love to get a sense, maybe just a quick questions. If you think about the word operations in a business, what are the things that would come to mind to you? Maybe just shout it out. Coffee machines, yes. Anything else? Checklists, okay. Processes, yes, I have a slide on process. Sorry? Conversations? Optimizations, yes. Business development could be part of it. So today I would talk about maybe operations as a business broadly. So this will affect things like growth, things like product. But one of the things that I think is probably core to when you think about the word operations, one of the key words most likely going to be execution. Right? So how do I execute? How do I make sure my team executes? So in the broader scheme of a company, very often you talk about, okay, what's the market size of the place? What is the innovation you're driving as a team? What's the core product what are you actually changing? And then it very quickly turns to, now that we have this amazing market, we have a disruptive or a very creative product that will really capture a lot of the market share, how do we then execute against that market with our product? And so today I really want to talk about what it means in this scheme of scaling a business and then what it means to execute against some of that vision. And to start with, one of our board members and I highly recommend getting independent board members, especially once you go into the Series A stage, because you have a lot of mistakes that you can avoid. And one of our board members, he founded a large European travel company as well. And one of the first things he told us, and there's a good quote, is clarity is the key to execution. So very often, especially if you're leaders of your business or leaders of a certain function in your business, in your company, could be founder, it could be head, could be VP or something, if the teams are not executing, very often it's not because they suck, but because you didn't create the clarity of what actually needs to be done. What is good, what is actually great? When is someone overperforming? When is someone meeting or exceeding goals? So today I want to create some frameworks around what clarity means from top to bottom. And another framework I want to give you in this context, and this has been a framework that's really helped me, is as we think about building a business and scaling a business, especially if you're a first-time founder or have really never, or maybe you have an experienced professional but you have never founded a company before, then a lot of the question is, how do I actually get the skills and the knowledge, and how do I learn about these things? And a good framework here is about how to learn. So I'm from Beijing originally, so I give you a Confucius quote. So the quote is, by three methods may we learn wisdom. First by reflection, which is the noblest. Second by imitation, which is easiest. And third by experience, which is the bitterest. And so what this means is, so by reflection is basically, you have a problem, you think about it, you come up with a solution, and then you learn about it. The second one is by imitation, which is basically best practice. You want to run a customer service, ask some other people how to run customer service. And the third one is by experience, which means you actually have to do it to develop your own solution, which you cannot just, so for example, one of the topics we'll talk about later is things like company culture. You cannot just sit down in your ivory tower and think about, oh, this is the ideal culture I want to achieve with my team, and it doesn't actually reflect reality. You also cannot just copy paste the company culture of another business, and I'll talk about that later in a sec. And so you have to understand for different scenarios and different situations which learning concept to apply, whether you want to reflect on it and think about it and create something, and that's also a learning process for your business, whether you want to copy someone, which is totally legitimate, or if you want to actually trial and error. So in the context of product development, A/B testing would be learning through experience. Okay, so now we actually get to the real content. When you think about a business, there are different layers, so don't focus on the arrows for now, just focus on the different fields. So at the very top of the business, you probably have a mission, and I will go, and there will be slides for each of these. And a mission like, why do we exist, why are we here, what are we trying to accomplish, whether it's Google or trying to organize the world's information, or whatever. So then you have a certain vision of what does it actually look like in a couple of years' time. You have a strategy of actually how to maybe get there. You have things like, what is your structure? So that's the team, the organizational setup, the various reporting functions. Underneath that you have OKRs and KPIs. Who's familiar with OKRs? Okay, who's not? Okay, great. KPIs, okay, probably familiar with that. Then processes, of course, underneath that you have the culture and the people. And I think what's a good framework to think about is, as you go from the top to down, is basically the how do I achieve that. If I have a certain mission, the how, so basically the vision is the how to the mission. The strategy is the way to achieve the vision. The structure is the way you achieve the strategy. Again, the KPIs, also again, so KPIs and structure basically support the strategy, and then the processes should support all of that, and so on. And if you go from the bottom up, basically the question should always be why. So if you have a certain, so maybe exclude culture a little bit from the why arrow, but basically if you have a certain process, why do I have this process? What goals does this help accomplish? If you have, more importantly, if you have a certain company structure, why does this structure exist in this certain form? Because it should be supporting a certain strategy. So there's a saying that structure always follows strategy. And again, if you have a strategy, how does that ultimately support your 10-year vision or your ultimate mission of the business? And this is not a picture we had on day one, and very often what happens is you hone on maybe in one quarter on strategy and really get this right, or you at some point really focus on culture, or at some point really focus on developing KPIs, and I think it will be too ambitious to say, okay, every seed or growth stage company will have this perfectly figured out, perfectly laid out. If you have, great, but maybe it's over-engineered. So it doesn't mean you need to have all of these things, but I think it's helpful to have the framework and the context in which you think about the different elements of running your business. And obviously, so I'll run through some of these topics in brief. obviously for all these topics, there's tremendous depth. I mean, for strategy, people go to MBA and study for 2 years, right? So there's a lot of more depth to each of these topics. Or OKRs, there are entire training classes and video tutorials on how to do OKRs. So we won't cover that in depth, but I will recommend some further reading. Okay, let's start with the mission. So mission is pretty straightforward. This is really just, if you think about, if you keep asking the why question inside a business, okay, why? I'll give you an example from our company. So customer service agent may ask, why am I sitting here? Okay, well, you have to achieve a certain customer service satisfaction, so CSAT, and you have to achieve it in a certain time. And then the question is why? Well, the reason why is because we believe, and we've seen in the data, that if you answer a customer in a satisfactory way, and if you do it in a very quick time, so imagine you're a customer, then this makes the customer more loyal, right? And so why do I care about loyal? Well, because loyalty is part of our strategy. Our strategy is not to only get customers into the marketplace ecosystem, but to make them sticky and remain, because ultimately we want customers to maybe book an iconic attraction with us in Rome, but hopefully next time they go somewhere else, they use us directly because they trust the brand. So loyalty is part of the overall growth strategy. And now the question is, why do we have this growth strategy? Why do we even care about growth? It's because fundamentally we believe that the goal or the vision that we have is that we want to have a lot of market share. This is a 100 billion plus market, and in order for us to truly change this market, we need to have a very clear vision of how to get there, and ultimately it supports and why do we care about market share? Is because it supports the fundamental mission of our business, that we want to turn trips into amazing experiences for every traveler in the world. So whoever you are, wherever you travel, you shouldn't be spending all your time and on your money on flying economy class or staying in hotels, but really think about how can you turn your trip into a better experience. If you go to Rome and, for example, 7 a.m. we have this really cool tour where you can enter the Vatican before anyone else, so it will be completely empty. You can go through the Vatican museums with a small group, super cool experience. After that, maybe you have a nice coffee nearby, and then in the afternoon, maybe you take a day trip, go shopping, or maybe you take a pasta making class or do some wine tasting. Or do some underground stuff. So there's a lot of interesting things, and we believe that if you do that, that is a better trip than just walking through the streets with a map and really not learning anything. So the mission is at the top of the why chain, and that is why you're there. What's important, I think, is in the early days of a startup, the why is to survive, right? Very clear. And that is actually why it's interesting when you look at the intensity level of how people operate in a business. In the early days, super intense. Everybody's super fired up, working late, super creative, super collaborative. Why? Because that sense of purpose is so strong. If I don't pull my weight, this ship will sink, right? And so what's interesting is as we see the company then develop, there will be, maybe in the Series A or once you go past 50 people, you will see that some of the motivation slumps because you bring a lot of people in and you expect all of them to have the same sense of urgency and same sense of purpose, but then it's not there because they don't really know why they're there. Maybe they just want to have a job, fine. I would argue that in a growth company, that's maybe not the right attitude to have, and so you need to create that sense of purpose. It's really important. I think it's also important that the mission may evolve over time. So when we started out Get Your Guide, our mission was not to turn trips into amazing experiences. Well, first you want to survive, and then we started out, hey, we want to really disrupt the market for sightseeing tours. Or actually in the early days, it was just create a cool peer-to-peer experience. So this mission may evolve over time, and I think the sign of a really good business is that this mission can evolve over time. If you look at, for example, companies like IBM, the mission of IBM changes every 20 years. So in the early days, obviously it was about computing. Today, IBM's mission is about giving corporations, so larger corporations, the transformational power to actually compete in the new economy of digital and machines. So the mission of a company can evolve over time. And I think a common mistake is to make it a brand slogan because it's not about the customer proposition. The mission is very much an internal thing. So your employees should know why you're doing this. Your investors should know why you're doing this. You should know why you're doing this. So that's kind of the mission. And so a question to all of you then is to think about why do you exist as a business, and why should anybody care? Why should you care? Why should your parents care? Why should your employees care? Why should your investors care? Why should customers care? So why do you exist? Next one is vision. So this one, honest opinion is, this is not as important as mission or strategy, which are more in between. So I guess a differentiator between a mission and a vision is that a vision has a more finite timeline. So as in, I believe this business in 5 to 10 years can be X. So we believe we can be in, 2,000 cities, so on and so forth. Now, what this exercise helps you with is it helps you paint a picture of what actually the key pillars and key growth vectors of your business are. So if you say, in 5 to 10 years, we want to be in X amount of cities, so for us, in X amount of customer markets, so German customers, French customers, then by definition, you're already defining those pillars as core growth vectors of your business. So it's maybe a helpful exercise to actually narrow those growth vectors a little bit. And I think a question to ask, even if you're just starting out or thinking to start out, sometimes it's not an exercise you have to run every day, but once in a while ask yourself, where do I want to be in 5 years, and why is that attractive? Why is that picture in 5 years attractive, and ultimately also helps your fundraising pitch as well. Okay, next one is the juiciest one. It's also, I would say, the most difficult to get right, and there's a reason people study MBAs for that. It's strategy. So before you read the entire slide, so strategy, I would say, is probably the one thing that we underestimated the most, because you think like, oh, you build a cool product, you just scale it, and shit just works. And I think it's especially if you go in with this attitude of, all these strategy consultants and MBAs and whatever, corp dev people, they're slow, bureaucratic. So strategy by definition is unnecessary or not important. And this has been a really, really big learning for us that, basically operating the company for, I think, the first 3 years, we were challenged by some of our board members to ask, what is your strategy? And basically we didn't have one, right? So the operations we had was, grow inventory, grow customer demand, build a better product, and just grow, right? So growth is not a strategy, and because it's purely opportunistic. What does growth mean? The definition of a strategy means you say no to certain things, which allows you to say yes to other things more clearly and more loudly. So let's go real quick. What are some elements of strategy? This is by all means not a definitive list, and you ask anyone and they will give you different versions of strategy. Maybe a nice picture to visualize what strategy means is basically the consistent path in the fog of war. So I realize, war analogies in Berlin, but so basically it's, if you're basically in the woods, you don't know where the enemy lines are, you don't know where your own troops are, and all of these things, the strategy is the direction that keeps you going. It doesn't teach you how to fight the exact next battle, but basically tells you overall the direction and the approach and the principles that your company or your unit is pursuing. So what are elements of a good strategy? First of all, I think this is very simple. It should have, I would say, anything between a 12 to 24-month horizon. Anything shorter than that, it becomes more tactics. Anything longer than that, it becomes a little bit visionary. It should have real-world business outcomes that is targeted and important. So what does that mean? So growth is not a real-world outcome. A real-world outcome could be, I want to achieve X amount of market share in something because I believe that is very, very important. That is a very measurable business outcome. We believe market share is important because whatever reason. Or we believe our strategy is to corner the market for 25 to 30-year-olds in Spain because we believe this is important for these and that reasons. So a strategy has a very clear outcome where you can say, did we achieve the strategy or not? And also a strategy should be attractive and should be differentiated. So it should be different from others. So by definition, if you just say we just want to grow, that's not a strategy because everybody wants to grow. How do you want to grow, right? And another thing around strategy is there should be some kind of financial target attached to it. So if you want to say I want to capture market share in a certain market, how do I measure the financial outcomes? Because later on, what investors want to see is they're basically investing into, sure, your market size, your product, and your team. But once they're invested, they want to know what is your strategy. What am I, now that my money is in, I believe in the overall picture, it's great. How are you actually going to deploy the money? And how are you going to invest as a business? So if I give you 10 million, what's going to happen with it? because just growth is not a strategy. Just saying we're going to hire people is not a strategy, right? These are all enablers in order to achieve a certain strategy. Shouldn't be too detailed, so don't have like 2,000 KPIs around a strategy. Again, it's more about the consistent path in the fog of war rather than the exact details. For the details, you can then have OKRs and KPIs, which we'll go into a second. Lays out principles of operations. What this means is basically, so for example, if the strategy of the German street system is to have no accidents, then the principles of operations are the, how do you drive, the rules of engagement. So, and this is really important because we'll talk about processes later, is principles are much more important than processes because you will in no way have a process for every possible situation. Now, what could be a principle? If one of your goals is market share, and let's say you have market share in a certain market, then the competitor starts attacking you. You don't have a perfect playbook for everything, but if your goal is to say, my strategy is market share, then your principle could be, we defend the market share at any cost, right? So if somebody comes attacks your market share through whatever means, and there's 1,000 ways the competition will attack you, then a principle is we defend it at any cost would be a principle. Another principle could be, we don't, right? I mean, so there are different ways you can take principles, but principles should be very few, and they should really guide how you think about executing on the strategy. And ultimately, of course, there should be certain steps towards it, so you should know how am I on track with the strategy. Common mistakes. So these are all from us, not having one. We didn't have one. So when one of our board members came in and said, look, what's your strategy? Well, we didn't have one. It's too tactical, so you get too much into the details. Strategy should be everybody should know your strategy and should fit on a page, half a page. Too broad, so grow, is not differentiated. Lack of focus. And also, and this is a good one, the strategy should be, so in the framework of how do you come up with a strategy, should be very, very much based on, sure, some external influence, but a lot on your own reflection of how you want to win in your business. So it takes conviction. The opposite of conviction is just to listen to your board members when they say go to China, right? So, fortunately, our board members never said that, but I've heard many investors tell their, oh, China's. I've heard from other entrepreneurs, yeah, my board member told me I need to go to the United States because it's a huge market. If we just get 1% of that, so yeah. Obviously listen to advice, but strategy is all about your conviction because ultimately the investors give you money, so you develop a strategy that you're convinced of. And if within your own team you just say, oh, I'm following this strategy because someone else told me that this would be a good thing to do, then it's not very credible. And so I think maybe a good litmus test, if you think about your own business, is what are your bets, right? What are you really, really betting on? What are some risky assumptions over the next 12 to 24 months that you really want to bet on? Structure. Structure is probably the one where, so the most common mistake with strategy is that companies don't have one. The most common mistake with structure is that people have really messed up ones. So structure, so the first thing, I mean, what happens a lot, like, in the early days, you have a company and you give everybody a title, everybody's a C title, C level or something. And suddenly, your first customer service employee becomes head of customer service, and then you have this weird structure where suddenly one person reports to another person, and then, or you only have 2 direct reports while somebody else has 10 direct reports, or you have 7 C levels for a Series A company. I've seen everything. And so I think this is probably the one area where it's best just to follow best practices. There are so many best practices on organizational design. I mean, there's an entire subsegment of the consulting industry only dedicated to organizational design, and you should not get too creative. The only creative part which you should have, the bias you should take, I think, is how does it support your core strategy. So for example, one of the best practices is you should make very, very clear trade-offs in terms of reporting lines. There is a very good book that I highly recommend reading, is High Output Management by Andy Grove. Andy Grove, actually the inventor of OKRs, former president of Intel. And he has a section on organizational design. But one of the core principles of organizational design and structure is ideally a lot of the reporting is functional. So meaning salespeople report to salespeople and engineers report to engineering. for the primary reason that there's a career path and a very strong coaching line. So so if I'm a head of sales, I can tell salespeople what to do because I can help coach them into competencies, into behaviors. Same for engineering, same for product. The only case where you would have people retort to a mission line, so what would be a mission line? So for example, if one of your missions is to win China, and then you need to have product, engineering, sales only reporting to head of China because you want to win China, then you can make that trade-off, but it has to be a very, very deliberate trade-off, and it shouldn't happen in too many instances. The only reason why you would want a mission reporting is because you need to react to changes in the market very quickly. And that can be a very, very elemental reason, but it has to be very deliberate. Clear ownership is clear, best practice is clear. So what are some common mistakes we've seen? One of the things I often see is like, and we've done this as well, is we hired this really, really strong person, and we just want to build an organization around him or her. And of course, that's stupid. I think what happens a lot as well is politics. So if your organizational thing is not clear, meaning different teams own the same thing, then that's a recipe for disaster. So you can have functional lines, and then you want to have cross-functional missions that cut across. So for example, I mean, the simplest example is in product and engineering. You have a PM, you have some engineers, and maybe some design. It needs to be very clear who in that organization sets the direction. So and different organizations do it differently. So if you go to Google, which is a much more engineering-driven organization, a lot of the business decisions and business ownerships lies with engineering, versus in a more product-driven organization, maybe lie with product. Doesn't mean one is right or wrong. You have to choose, and it's okay to choose either way. Just has to be super, super clear. I mean, a very common one, overhead. I mean, I think people always say that they don't do this, but even in our organization, sometimes we have like one person managing two people, and it's just, the question is that the way to go about it, or is there a different way you can actually create more efficiency, because it just doesn't make sense for one person to manage two people. Another thing is also change it regularly, right? And that is based on the notion of structure follows strategy. If your strategy changes, maybe so should your structure. One example, one of the teams that typically changes a lot, also in our organization, I would say every 12 to 18 months, is, for example, the content organization. Because content is really everywhere, and it's critical in so many different areas, from marketing to your product, to your inventory, to really all communications. And if you add new functions, new missions, new strategies, then you should also be adapting that part of the organization. So don't be afraid of organizational change, but don't get too creative, I think is the key. So one of the questions that usually, as a good exercise, I sometimes do with early stage companies, is the first question when I meet a company usually is, draw me the org chart, okay? And then assign KPIs on that org chart to different people. And then you, of course, before that, ask him, what is the most important KPI in your business and who owns that? And just as you should have cascading KPIs, you should have cascading ownerships of the different KPIs, of the different structures. Next is OKRs and KPIs. Don't want to go too much into this. I would say we introduce OKRs. Maybe for those who don't know OKRs are objectives and key results. So for example, on a company level, it could mean win the Champions League, right? Okay, very sad topic. My team just got eliminated yesterday. Maybe talk about something. Anyway, win the Champions League could be the goal, right? That could be the high-level objective for your team. And then, for example, for the recruiting team, it could mean hire the best talent that in 4 years we can win. And then for the coaching team is whatever. And then you basically break it down. So you have a very aspirational objective, and then very measurable key results to make sure that you're on track. So if the objective is win the Champions League, maybe 3 of the key results could be A, hire, in this year, recruit the 3 top stars that come onto the market. Number 2, whatever, you can come up with your things. And then for KPIs, I think it's underestimated. As the DNA of our business has always been very, so we all have a science or econ background, and we always thought we were very good with numbers. But one of the things this board member did with us, for example, he actually, he called Johannes actually in the middle of the night, I think 1 a.m., and asked him like, hey, what are your top 2 KPIs? Of course he didn't know them. And so if you think about it, if you call everyone on your team at 1 a.m. and ask them, or actually just ask them during the day, what are your 2 KPIs? I would bet 80% of the time they don't know, right? So what are really the 2 KPIs? And then the next question is, why are those KPIs important, and how do those KPIs actually then support the higher level KPIs? As a business, what are the 2 numbers you absolutely have to own this year, and why are they important? And I think, again, I think that the key mistake is because KPIs sound so simple, because yeah, sure, it's numbers, you measure it, it very quickly falls into the trap of omission, and you just don't do it. Another common mistake is, oh, my work can't be measured. All right, and there are some teams who say, this is super important, it can be measured. I think what's important here is everything can be measured. You just have to measure differently. So another trap that we sometimes did is, for a very long time, we didn't invest into topics like maybe brand, because, well, it can't be measured, right? Or like you ask someone, hey, I want to do a brand investment, like, oh, okay, how do you measure this? Ooh, it's very hard. And then you say, well, if it can be measured, we don't do it. Now, that's also the wrong approach, right? So different initiatives may have different ways to measure things, or maybe different timelines to measure things. So if you think about brand, that investment has a different time horizon. They may have a 1 or 2 year time horizon, and you measure it very differently. So also over-measuring KPIs. So don't let KPIs become an excuse for not doing something, but vice versa, don't let anyone get away with the excuse of my work cannot be measured. Everything can be measured in some degree, even if it's just a survey to participants of the session. So how do I measure the quality of the speech? Well, it cannot be measured, right? But you can just send a survey around, and if 90% of the people say 4 or 5 out of 5, then I was successful. If not, I was not. So everything can be measured. Processes. I think for a very long time, we, especially I and different teams, we over-relied on processes. And one of the symptoms of a company that has too many processes, like we maybe did, I was in the first 4 years, is because strategy is not clear, structure is not clear. I mean, ideally, you have no process, right? Because ideally, it's so clear to everyone what has to be done, or things are so automated that you don't have to follow step by step by step by step. So there is so Jeff Bezos, obviously Amazon. He has one of the things he always says is don't become slaves to your proxies. So a proxy is something that is a tool that you introduce in your business. So OKRs, for example, is a process. It's the process by which you set goals for the quarter. Now, you can very quickly become slaves to your process by saying, oh, I cannot do this because I have this, or in order to have good goals, they have to be shaped a certain way. I cannot attend this meeting because I got to do my OKRs, whatever. So ultimately, it's very important that the proxies or the tools in the process are your slaves. You don't become slaves to your processes, and you're willing to change your processes depending on the current strategy, the structure, different KPIs. I think a good test in your business to think about processes, ideally they're invisible, because a good process should empower people. And a good symptom to see if it's doing that job is to ask your people, when they start to complain, oh, there's too much process, well, then you should really question your processes. Or they question that, I don't know how to do this, it's not very clear, maybe you need to establish a process. So I would say process, be very, very careful. It very quickly becomes this, it's kind of like drugs. You get a sense of control, but it's not real control, because real control comes from clarity of your strategy and your KPIs and your mission and all those things. If those things are clear, then you should trust your teams to execute very well against it. Last but not least, so culture. I heard that some of the people and culture topics have been covered already a lot. That said, I always want to talk a little bit about culture because it is such an important element of everything. And Peter Drucker, a very famous management guru, he basically invented the science of management and wrote many good books. A very good one is The Effective Executive, very good book. And one of the things he always says is culture eats strategy before breakfast. And the reason for that is strategy can change. Culture shouldn't change so quickly. And so if you think about culture, again, it's one of those terms that's super fuzzy, right? Could be like strategy. So I think it's really important that within your organization, you also make it very clear, what does actually culture mean to you? You will have your own definitions. I don't think there's a right one. But so for me, the way I look at culture, there are 2 key elements. One is values. So those, I think we all know what values are. So those are directional, moral sentiments that we think are important. And then there are, I think more importantly, behaviors. And a behavior is something that somebody does something a certain way. And of course, those behaviors should be derived from values. So I give you an example from our core values. So one of our core values is learning, right? Personal growth. So directionally, I think everybody in this room would agree, right? Learning, super important, personal growth. Now, the thing is, how do you decide if somebody is doing a good job on that value? How is someone exceeding? Because you want to make culture part of your interview process, part of your review process, part of your ongoing coaching and management of your team process. And so the question is, how do you actually know someone is doing a good job or exceeding in culture, or is a cultural role model? And so for us, for example, we say that as part of learning, one of the key things is stepping outside the comfort zone. So learning should be uncomfortable. It should be highly uncomfortable. If it's always comfortable, then you're not learning, right? Then you're just reading blogs. If it's just reading blogs, oh, it's cool, easy on a Sunday with a cafe, that's not learning, right? Learning should be deeply uncomfortable, because another statement that we say with learning is make learning a habit, right? So learning fundamentally, especially for yourself, is when you develop a new habit, and changing habits is painful. So learning should feel like going to the gym, jogging. I hate jogging. But it should feel like jogging, right? Where it's uncomfortable, but you feel, your lungs are getting better, or certain things improve. So learning should be deeply uncomfortable. It should be made a habit. And also, and this is also important in our organization, we say that you own your development. So it's not the job of your manager to develop you. It's your responsibility to grow. And your manager should, of course, coach you. They should help you. But it doesn't mean that, oh, I'm here, now I'm waiting for my next class, right? So when people say, I want to grow, then the next question is usually, oh, great, where do you want to go? What's your growth plan? Give me some ideas. Maybe I can help you with that, right? But you should ultimately own your own development. So those are some of the cultural behaviors that we associate with the value of learning for us. And in your business, you should be thinking around, okay, what are some of the values that we hold important? And then what are very, very specific behaviors underneath of that that would describe that? An exercise you can do in order to distill those values or behaviors is, if you think about the top people in your organization, and in the beginning this can be just the founders, and then you write down, like, why are these people amazing, right? What have they done? And then from what they have done, you can distill, how did they do it? What were behaviors? How did they approach a certain thing? And from that, you can very quickly derive your behaviors. That's actually what we did recently. It should be 80% descriptive, so it should be that's what makes it authentic, and it should be, I would say, more or less 20% aspirational, because there's always a better version of ourselves, and we should aspire to that. So there's always some room to grow. Talk about behaviors. It's owned by all employees, so it's not something that management owns culture, or even worse. I think we did this in the beginning. Oh yeah, culture is an HR topic. They do cultural events. It has to be owned from the very top, which means leading by example, living those behaviors. And that's, again, why it needs to be descriptive, needs to be authentic. And I think in the early days, a mistake we did is, this one I did. So I was reading this book, Delivering Happiness by Tony Hsieh, about Zappos, and he talks about values. It's like, oh, that's great. And then so, okay, we should have values. And then what I did is using the framework of imitation instead of reflection. So Netflix culture deck, Amazon 15 leadership principles, Zappos, they have some core values, and did a best of, and then just send it around like, these are our values, right? This is now our core values, and this is going to be great. Obviously it didn't work. People didn't think it was authentic. Fell flat because it wasn't authentic from how we led as a leadership team, and it didn't describe our business at all. So I don't think there's one right culture, but there should be a culture that is 80% of who you are and 20% of where you want to go. I think, and then the litmus test maybe for you to ask, if you think about your organization, what are cultural traits where, if there's a superstar, I don't know, engineer, salesperson, analyst, whatever, what is a cultural trait you would not hire him or her for, right? So, so where would you say no? And it cannot be something as simple as, oh, he's an asshole, right? So it has to be something that actually hurts. It has to be something where another organization would hire this person for, but you won't, right? Again, it's very similar to strategy. The more you say no, the more strongly you say yes to a certain behavior. So up to this date, So both Johannes and I, we still review every interview. Every candidate that comes into Get Your Guide will have a final interview with us, which is primarily a culture interview to make sure that we maintain that culture. Because one of the things we've learned is it's very, very hard to build a culture and super, super easy to lose it. One person who doesn't fit doesn't mean that they're the wrong person or a bad person. Just means maybe there's not a good cultural fit with our organization. And basically what then happens, you have organ rejection, and then just things go to hell. So you want to make sure that what are cultural traits you would not hire a rock star person for, and also what is a culture trait where if you have someone who's great, what would you fire him or her for? So culture should be really, should draw a line in terms of behaviors of what you accept or don't. That is it for the slides. So this should give a rough overview of, these are some of the topics that also I think about, that we think about in leadership teams. So in the leadership team, we will very often discuss every quarter, what's a strategy? Does it still support our overall mission? In the strategy, what are some of the objectives and key results for this quarter that support the strategy? What are the relevant KPIs we should be measuring? What are the BI solutions, data warehouse reportings that we should set up in order to measure the KPIs that support the strategy? And then what is the culture? Every quarter we think about our culture, how can we improve our culture, what are cultural gaps we have. Out of the 5 core values and around 19 core behaviors supporting those core values, where are our key gaps in those 19 behaviors? And for example, we know that 4 of those 19 behaviors today in our company do not live very well. We can measure it, we send surveys, so you can act on those. So these are very, very actionable things that we invest a lot of time on. And as the more your organization scales, the more you need clarity on these things. So as mentioned in the beginning, a lot of these seems like overhead, but especially as your company grows, you need to provide that leadership and that clarity, because if there's no clarity in your teams, they cannot execute. And if they cannot execute, then you cannot fulfill the overall mission of your company. So that is that. Thank you very much. Hope it was a bit helpful.
Hi, thanks very much. Picking up on the point of clarity and thinking about the first slide that you showed, there was something at the bottom which I'm not seeing here, and I think this is particularly important when you're thinking about clarity, is how clear is all of that to your people and how do you ensure that? Specifically, I'm thinking about your onboarding process.
So you mean how to test how clear it is?
How do you instill it? How do you follow up on it? How much is that driven by your line managers to middle management and so on?
So, okay, maybe 2 answers. So I think one is how do you detect a lack of clarity? I think that's one, and then how do you then ensure clarity? So I think that the first one is maybe a bit easier to. So maybe the second one. I don't think there's one clear answer of how do you ensure full clarity. I think one is certainly, are you aligned at the very top? So if you ask the leadership team, what is your strategy? Everybody should have used the same words exactly, right? Or if you ask the question around structure, there should be widespread agreement on this is the common structure. I think another thing is repetition. One of the heuristics we use is if you have to explain strategy or the mission to your people and you get so tired of listening to it, that's the right amount of repetition you have. So when you believe that you cannot talk about it anymore because it becomes so repetitive, that is when maybe it's becoming more clearer to everyone else. So that's kind of a heuristic we use. But I think across these different things, there are different ways to institutionalize mission and vision. I think strategy is really about if they are also, if they have to be very simple, that's why they should be short. So if the strategy takes 2 pages, then of course nobody will know because they cannot memorize it. So there's a certainly, you want to bias for simplicity rather than full comprehensiveness because there's a strong value and a premium on simplicity. I think on OKRs and KPIs, make them very, very public and send a daily email. So all of our teams get a daily email with their KPIs, at least those that are relevant for them. Again, repetition and visibility, and the same for, I think, culture as well. So make it very visible in the recruiting process. There's a culture fit interview. People know there's a culture fit interview. In the onboarding, they know culture is important. You want to repeat that in your one-on-ones with your folks. So talking about, hey, observe these certain behaviors. One of the things our people team introduce is, you can give different tools you can use to give praises. I observed that someone did a really good thing that really showcased the value of learning. I'm going to give them a praise. In our case, if you get 5 praises on a certain value, you get a T-shirt on that value. So there's different. I think you can get very creative, but I think more importantly, there's different ways how to achieve clarity, and there's some best practice on that. But I think more importantly is how often people underestimate that there is no clarity. And one of the things that we, for example, do is, so one of the things we have is a Pizza Friday, which is every Friday, a little bit of pizza and lots of beer. I don't know why it's called Pizza Friday, but it's more like Beer Friday. But so basically, that's a great opportunity to just grab anyone and just ask them, hey, by the way, when it comes to culture and learning, right, what are your 2 development goals right now, right? And if it's not there, well, maybe that's not very clear. Or, tell me about the company strategy. Like, how would you describe company strategy in your own words, right? And if 10 people give you 6 different answers, then, well, clearly as a leader, you have failed in the strategy. So I think more, and very often, I think what happens in businesses is that you hear something and you feel like, oh, that's just an exception, right? Okay, this person just didn't get it. She didn't get it. He didn't get it, right? But rather, I think a key realization in leadership is that usually a symptom points to a structural problem, and that structural problem often is a lack of clarity. So what I would encourage leaders is, take that one tiny deep dive feedback extremely serious, because usually it points to a structural problem or a structural clarity or whatever.
That's pretty clear.
My name is Stefan. Very impressive what you achieved the last 9 years, and I'm questioning, you could also present this as a manager of a corporate with all these capabilities. Are you more a manager or more an entrepreneur, and what's the difference between management and entrepreneurship?
Sure. So, there's a lot of these sayings like, leaders, managers do things right and leaders do the right things. I strongly disagree. I think ultimately management is a core skill. So management is about leadership, right? It's about being a coach, getting the right team in place, bringing the best out of your team, coaching your team. I think, you can go on and on about football analogies. So I think entrepreneurship for me, so I think management and leadership is a skill. There are certain things you can do. How do I coach people? How do I recruit people? How do I develop people? How do I motivate people? How do I set up the teams in the right way? How do I create structure? I think independent of whether you're an entrepreneur or not, this is important for leadership. And you take some companies like Amazon that have tremendous, you could say, entrepreneurial spirit despite the organization size, and the reason for that is they certainly use some of these best practices. Now, secondly, when you think about entrepreneurship, I think that is more around an attitude that you take, and there's different definitions of entrepreneur with an I. I think one definition I read is quite nice. Is entrepreneur basically pursues an objective with very, very limited resources and a high non-zero chance of failing, right? And pursues it anyway because the goal is very aspirational and very attractive. So what happens in corporations is then people don't take risks or don't pursue something because the risk of failure is much higher than the potential reward for success, because there's this matrix of if you make a decision and you end up being right or being wrong, and if people agreed or disagreed, only in 1 out of the 4 boxes you get credit, for the other 3 you don't, right? So from a pure psychological behavior, humans are smart, you would think that, okay, it's better than not to take any risks and always go with the flow or not take the unpopular decision, right? So I think entrepreneurialism for us, even inside our company, is really about, are you taking the right risks? Are you thinking about, not, the first question to something shouldn't be, can I get more resources? But, okay, cool, let me figure something out, right? So I think that's about being an entrepreneur. And if you think about the traits of a founder entrepreneur, it's not so much actually about risk-taking, it's about uncertainty tolerance. They've done lots of studies of entrepreneurs. Usually actually they're white and from privileged families because you have a lower opportunity cost. So if you fail, you fall on very soft grounds. However, what you definitely see with very successful entrepreneurs is a very, very high uncertainty tolerance. So it's okay to do something for a very long time with an uncertain payoff, even if the ultimate risk to yourself is not very high. But being very comfortable with that uncertainty, because that allows you to take a risk for a longer time, which means you can take a bigger bet on certain things. So for us, I think entrepreneurial can be very much a cultural trait that you can achieve in both corporations as well as in smaller companies.
Hi, how do you make sure that you're not turning people into robots by measuring everything they do?
Well, I think the first step is awareness that people are not robots. Sounds simple, but for example, one of the, I think it starts with conversation. So I think, again, just like clarity is important for an organization, to not treat people like robots starts with the awareness that people are not robots, right? And if you think about people, then you think about there are emotions and feelings involved. So, for example, one of the things we recommend to our managers is, when you start a one-on-one, when you start a meeting, when you see someone in the morning, maybe don't start with what are your KPIs, right? So the first question should be more like, how are you feeling, right? So don't ask how are you doing, because people always say great. Right? So if you want to elicit a more genuine response, how are you feeling is the typical textbook coaching advice for how do you turn a robot manager into a more empathetic manager. Another way I think is very important is then to consider, there's a lot of things. I think empathy, I think, is the key word, right? So understanding that the other person is a person, that they will have up and downs, and ultimately realize that the success of the person is very much interlinked with the success of the business. The business cannot be successful if the people are not successful. And one of the, I would say, call it processes or principles that we apply as a good book is called The Alliance by Reid Hoffman. So that principle is about the notion that you want to treat people's careers as an alliance between you and the company. I think probably goes into too much detail, but basically it means that the age of lifetime employment is over. So you're not going to come to us and say, hey, I'm going to be at your company forever, kind of like back in the days when you joined Sony, lifetime employment, retirement, and so on. Just like a company, especially in a growth stage, in a very uncertain environment, cannot say, oh, by the way, we will employ you for the rest of your life, take care of you, and we're family. And so I think the more honest response is to say, let's take a journey together for a finite time. Could be 2 years, 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. And in this time, the company from you will get X, but you will get X from the company, which could be personal development, could be skills, could be network, could be access, could be something else. If you think about it, so for example, the typical consulting, so if you enter BCG, McKinsey, or any of those, if you enter on an associate track, that is a very clear finite timeline, 2 years up or out. It's very, very clear, it's very, very fair. And so I think the key is to consider what are actually the aspirations of that person and creating an alliance that aligns those aspirations with the business operations and have very frequent check-ins whether those aspirations still align with your business objectives.
Hello. Imagine that I want to create a startup. What are the minimum or the most important of these concepts that I need to take in account?
Yeah, so I would say I think the most important things in a startup is a co-founder. I think that's that's the absolute minimum requirement. I think it's very hard to do by yourselves. I mean, some of the best businesses in Berlin, like Go Euro, have been built with single founders. Deepest respect. Very, very difficult. I think in the early days, I think this applies more once you have achieved product market fit and want to scale. I think in the early days it's really critical to, understand your market. How big is it? Is it actually viable? Is it something where I should even raise money, or should it just be, run on its own profits, which is totally legitimate. Not every company should be raising money. Some businesses need to raise money because there's network effects. So if you don't raise money, then you'll be outcompeted. So I think those are more the important questions around product market fit. Where do I want to take this company? And then if you do decide to scale it, I think these are some of the tools to enable the scaling.
Hi. You talked about when you start scaling up, you get employees on board who aren't as behind it as the original founders were, or the small team. And if you look at big companies, that's obviously the case that they're not like that. How much do you think that's an inevitable bit of growing a company and that should be embraced to increase retention or widen the pool of potential job candidates? And how much do you think you should try and essentially force them into the small company mentality, the work hardcore, long hours, focus mentality.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think it's everything has to be genuine. So it's hard to create a fake sense of urgency, and because it only lasts for basically maybe a couple of weeks. So that's very hard to enforce. So I think there are certain trade-offs between what you can do at an early stage and what you can do at a growth stage. So I would say there is a consistent, I would say those overall themes are more around the culture and what you can establish as very established behaviors. I don't think there is a very clear, I don't think there's a super simple answer to do that. Also, I think one of the things, if I realize looking back, those super crazy, just, work 100 hours. Okay, never worked 100 hours, that's not true. So more like, you work 70, 80 hours in the early days. Question mark of how productive they are, because one of the reasons you have to work those crazy hours is because there's no specialization in any of those things. You have to take of every little detail, right? Ordering the chair, that just takes another hour because you never ordered a chair before. So I think as you scale the business, you do also want to be cognizant of the fact, for example, if you want to hire very skilled workers, they will have family, right? So one of the things people talk about is diversity. There's also diversity of age. You want to take those things into consideration. Doesn't mean they don't care. One of our best employees leaves work every day at 6 p.m., deeply cares about the business, thinks about it all the time, delivers excellent results. So I think at the end of the day, one of the symptoms why people push for this, you got to just work hard, push hard, is because they don't know how to measure their output, right? Ultimately, if you can measure the success of what people are contributing, then you are less obsessed with pure face time. I think we all know those examples of, love Japan, but like, for example, in Japan, you cannot leave the office before your boss leaves the office. Now, is that very productive? So I think ultimately, do you want to be optimizing for a certain symptom, or what is truly the root cause of a certain behavior, and what can you fix there?
How do you avoid building a high on strategy, low on execution team or organization?
Mm-hmm. What would be an example of a high strategy, low execution?
So somebody could get a takeaway from your talk and prepare a very nice mission, vision, and strategy deck with all of those steps and processes, and then really not drive it through to execution.
Sure.
Right? So.
Very good question. I think that's certainly a risk. I think ultimately you can measure it if they actually deliver the OKRs or the KPIs. I think, and again, I think a lot of in the execution lies in the culture. So one of the things in our culture is to take initiative, just do it, do things on low resources. Don't always ask, like, I want 10 more resources. Asking, always pushing for solutions, not problems. So I think a lot of the execution lies in the behaviors that you want to observe in a certain person for a certain role. But ultimately, so the way we judge the performance of someone in our business, the results do matter. But if you only focus on results, for example, you create a fear of failure. Because if you don't hit a certain result, then you won't take risky bets. So I think the difficulty in evaluating people is you need to have very clear sense of what does a great engineer look like, what are behaviors of a great engineer, what does a great salesperson look like, what are behaviors of a great salesperson, and rather manage for that. It significantly increases the difficulty for the manager, because then the manager actually has to know what a great salesperson, great engineer is. But that we find is typically the better way to manage, because then you can also tell someone, here's a skill you're lacking, you need to develop that more. Right? So I think it's much more around what are the competencies and skills and behaviors in a great person, and what is the delta between maybe me and that aspirational role model behavior.
So not everyone in an organization is a numbers person. So you may have KPIs in place, but then people are not necessarily tracking these KPIs because they're not a numbers person. That's not their daily job. How do you then set up structures that can help them track this, where they can still do their job daily and they're not intimidated by, I have to be looking at a number or have to operate with a number in mind?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think that's certainly in the setup of the organization. So you may want to have a team that provides numbers for everyone. So I don't go into the database every day to pull my KPIs, right? There's a team that makes sure that KPIs are sent, that they're easy to digest, and you can actually measure the quality of that team by how digestible is the information provided. I think ultimately everybody should know at least one number, right? The main KPI. So, for example, in our customer service organization, everybody will know what is my average customer satisfaction score over the last month, because then I can actually improve it. So it doesn't mean you have to be doing crazy analyses on the data or be very creative in how you merge different pieces of data. I think certain teams require more of that skill set, but I think everyone should be able to quantify the work that they do and know at least the 1 or 2 numbers that matter to that person.
Just as a follow-up, and at what stage would a small company have a team that's dedicated to providing the numbers in a structured way? And what kind, in your example, what kind of resources did you need to have in place such that that team was able to provide those numbers for the other departments? Yeah,
it's probably hard to give like this is exactly when you have to do it at a certain number of people. I think it's a gradual transition. So in the early, certainly the top leadership team, the founders have to provide those numbers, right? You have to be extremely, I mean, as a founder, if you're not very numbers driven, it becomes increasingly difficult in a growth environment, just speaking to investors and so on. So I think somebody on the leadership really needs to provide those numbers. In our case, we at some point created a BI team, so business intelligence team, that then really builds a data warehouse, merges different, because the complexity starts once you have different sources of data. How do you merge them together into one digestible form? I think in our case, maybe it was around the Series B stage when we started to get one person to do it, and then you can scale that up. I mean, one part of the organization that in many organizations actually provides that is the finance organization. So if you have a very strong finance organization, they're typically very numbers driven, and they can provide a lot of the high level figures to understand the levers of growth.
Your organization aims to be present worldwide, if I get it right.
Yep.
And would you say that there is a certain part of your vision and your values, probably most important, and as follows strategy and structure and so on, that particularly aims to ensure that such a dispersed team works and performs on the same level with the same philosophy and carries on your approach, your core approach that you build up here in Berlin?
Mm-hmm. So you mean the question is there a certain part of the culture that specifically addresses the remote nature of some of the offices? Got it. Very good question. I think so one of our values is around passion, and passion can be mean very different things. And so one of the things so we're passionate about the customer, we're passionate about 10x, which means scale. But one of our behaviors around passion is also we embrace diversity. So we strongly believe as a travel business, if you want to have a global company, then the only way to make it work is if there's very strong cultural cohesion, and we actually view it as a competitive advantage. So I'll give you an example. If you are, Chinese example, so from China I can say this. So for example, a lot of Chinese companies, let's say they want to go to France, right? Then very often I hear from a friend of mine, he says, oh, I'm going to hire a Chinese person, send them over there. Obviously recipe for disaster, it's not going to work. The other version is he says, okay, I'm going to hire a French person, but we both don't speak English, right? So that creates actually a barrier to the business. So we actually embrace the fact that if we can create that cultural cohesion, it's a huge boon for our business. So we take that as a principle. Now, how does that principle manifest itself in terms of our operations? One example is every new employee gets onboarding in Berlin, right? Deep immersion, learns every team, go on a bunch of team events, so that they really, really get ingrained in the culture. What we also do a lot is we actually, take promising candidates, groom them in Berlin, and then send them somewhere else, right? Because one of the beauties of Berlin is that the access to global talent, especially mid-20s, late 20s, early 30s, very ambitious, very driven. You can hire them here, give them a vision, and then help let them open an office. We recently just sent one of our guys, started as a junior account manager, is now opening up our Cape Town office. So I think you have to make a deliberate investment because you believe that embracing diversity will build a competitive advantage. So ultimately it has to tie into the business sense, and we have seen this in companies that do it very well. And so that's why we pursue the same.
Cool. Well, thank you very much. Big applause.
De la famille. it.